Hey everyone, welcome back. And finally, a brand new season has begun in honor of Kings. And with this season, we've received some massive updates, especially to one of the most crucial aspects of the game, that is equipment. Yes, the developers have reworked almost every piece of equipment in the game. Along with that, they've introduced several new items and even removed some existing ones entirely. However, in this video, I'm not going to focus on the newly released equipment or the ones that were removed. Instead, I'll be discussing all the changes made to the already existing physical, magical, and defensive items in the game. I'll also share my personal opinions on these changes and evaluate whether each item has been upgraded, downgraded, or kept at a similar power level compared to before. To make everything easier to understand, and to make this video even more interesting, I've decided to categorize every piece of equipment into 3 different groups, based on how they were affected by the rework. The first category will be buffed, which includes items that I believe received meaningful improvements, or became stronger overall. The second category will be nerfed, where I'll place items that I think were significantly weakened and no longer perform as well as they used to. The third category will be balanced, which includes items that may have lost or gained certain stats but still perform roughly the same as before. I'll explain each piece of equipment briefly but clearly, just enough to help you understand what exactly changed and how you should think about using it in actual matches. My goal is to help you make better decisions when building items based on the situation rather than blindly following preset global builds. I truly believe this video will help increase your overall understanding of each equipment present in the game, especially for players who haven't taken the time to properly study equipment and simply stick to default builds without adapting. So before we move any further, I'd really appreciate it if you could both hype and like this video. And if you're on Instagram, make sure to give me a follow there as well. All of this support genuinely keeps me motivated to work harder and bring you even better content in the future. With that said, let's not waste any more time and roll the intro. So first I'm going to discuss physical equipment, and then we'll move on to magical and defensive items. The first physical item I want to talk about is none other than the infamous tank killer, Starbreaker. The scale of changes to this item is quite large. Previously, Starbreaker provided 10% cooldown reduction along with 40% physical penetration. Now that 10% cooldown reduction has been completely removed and the physical penetration has been reduced by 10%, making it noticeably less effective against tanky heroes. To compensate for these heavy nerfs, the developers added 7.5% movement speed, and while Starbreaker previously gave no bonus HP, it now provides an additional 700 HP. I've always called Starbreaker the infamous tank killer because, in the past, it was actually a very situational item. Players usually built it only when the enemy team had multiple tanks. But with these changes, you could say that Starbreaker is slowly turning into a more universal item rather than a purely situational one. It feels like the developers want players to build it more often, not specifically to counter tanks anymore, but instead for its overall stats. Another intention behind these changes, in my opinion, was likely to improve tank survivability. Previously, many fighters, marksmen, and assassins could run semi-tank builds, combining defensive items with Starbreaker. This allowed them to stay very tanky themselves, while still shredding frontline tanks with ease. They could harass and melt tanks while being half-tank, which made many players question, what's even the point of having tanks at all if other roles can abuse them so easily? Because of that, I believe the developers deliberately reduced Starbreaker's tank-busting power. And due to these changes, I'd place Starbreaker in the balance category. It still has value thanks to its generous stats, but marksmen and assassins who include it in semi-tank builds now pose much less threat. To deal serious damage again, they'll need to invest in more offensive items, meaning fewer defensive choices, and they can no longer cheat their way into being both extremely tanky and extremely deadly at the same time. There are generally 2 main types of builds for physical damage dealers, especially for marksmen. The first one is the crit build, and the second one is the on-hit build. A crit build focuses on increasing critical hit chance. It's an RNG-based build, where basic attacks have a certain probability to deal double damage. This type of build usually shines in the late game and is known for its high burst DPS potential. On the other hand, an on-hit build revolves around triggering special effects on enemies with every basic attack. These builds heavily rely on high attack speed to consistently activate their effects and deal sustained damage over time. The items that generally belong to the crit build include Sun Chaser, Shadow Ripper, and Daybreaker's Virtue. Meanwhile, items that are typically used for on-hit builds include Sparkforged Dagger and Doomsday. I'll first go through each crit item, and then move on to the on-hit items. Let's start with the first crit item, Sun Chaser. Previously, Sun Chaser could be considered a hybrid item because it worked well with both crit and on-hit builds. This was mainly because it provided a solid amount of both attack speed and crit rate. However, after the rework, its attack speed has been reduced by 10%. In exchange, it gained 5% additional crit rate and 2.5% extra movement speed. At first glance, these changes might not seem very impressive, and the stats may look underwhelming on paper. But in reality, Sunchaser is now an item with very strong overall value. At the moment, it can comfortably be built as a first item because it provides 40 physical attack, along with 15% crit rate and 7.5% movement speed. These are extremely valuable early game stats, allowing marksmen to gain damage, mobility, and crit scaling right from the start. Because of these changes, Sunchaser has now become a fully dedicated and reliable crit item, while its effectiveness in on-hit builds has been reduced. You might wonder whether it can still be used in on-hit builds, and the answer is yes, but I'll explain that part later. Originally, you could argue that these changes were meant to balance the item. However, considering how rare and valuable crit rate and movement speed are as stats in the game, I would personally classify this change as a buff rather than a simple balance adjustment. Next up is Shadow Ripper, the second crit item. Its price has been increased by 90 gold, and its crit rate has been reduced by 5%, going from 25% down to 20%. However, it did receive some compensation in return, specifically 5 extra physical attack and 2.5% additional movement speed. You could view this change as a small nerf, or you could also argue that it's more of a balance adjustment, especially since movement speed is still a relatively valuable stat in the game. Originally, I thought this item was straight up nerfed, but when you look at it purely from a stat perspective, it can reasonably be considered a balanced change. Even though it became slightly more expensive, crit builds still benefit a lot from Shadow Ripper, and it continues to perform well in its intended role. Because of that, I would ultimately classify this item as balanced rather than nerfed. The third item in the crit build is Daybreaker's Virtue. Previously, this item provided a very high amount of physical attack damage, but now that value has been reduced by 15 points. To compensate for this reduction, the developers added an extra 5% crit rate to the item. Overall, the strength of Daybreaker's Virtue hasn't really changed. The reason behind the physical attack reduction is tied to a larger system change in this patch. If you didn't read the patch notes carefully, you might have missed that most marksmen in the game received increased base physical attack and improved physical attack scaling. Since marksmen were already becoming stronger due to these buffs, reducing the physical attack provided by certain items, such as Sunchaser and Daybreaker's Virtue, was necessary to prevent them from becoming overwhelmingly strong. Previously, the common build path for crit-based marksmen was to start with Shadow Ripper because it provided the highest crit rate, followed by Daybreaker's Virtue and then Sunchaser as a later item. However, after these changes, the situation has shifted. Now, Sunchaser and Daybreaker's Virtue together provide an extra 10% crit rate, while Shadow Ripper has lost 5% crit rate. This further supports what I mentioned earlier, is that building Sunchaser first is now completely viable, and in many cases even preferable. With the current item stats, you can safely skip Shadow Ripper early, build Sunchaser first, then go straight into Daybreaker's Virtue, and only build Shadow Ripper afterward. This build order works very well for crit-based marksmen under the new changes. As for which category Daybreaker's Virtue belongs to, I would place it firmly in the balanced category. The trade-off between physical attack and crit rate keeps its overall power level the same, and I've already explained why this adjustment makes sense. Now let's discuss the next type of build, which is the on-hit build, and the first on-hit item I'm going to talk about is Doomsday. At first glance, the changes to Doomsday look really bad. They reduce 20 physical attack and 10% attack speed from the item, which makes it seem like Doomsday is already doomed, but that's actually not the case. In exchange for these removed stats, the item received 10% extra lifesteal, and on top of that, it now provides an additional 500 HP, which it did not have before. They also reworked its passive logic. The passive damage against jungle monsters and minion waves has been buffed, whereas previously it was limited and weaker. Because of this change, Doomsday is no longer a time-dependent item. You can now build it at almost any stage of the game. You can even buy it as a first item in the early game, which wasn't really viable before because its lifesteal was low and its damage to minions and jungle monsters was limited. Alternatively, you can also choose to buy it later in the game when you specifically need lifesteal. In short, if there's no need for anti-heal, then for most fighters and almost all marksmen, the strength of Doomsday now surpasses both Mortal Punisher and Bloodweeper, which I'll discuss shortly as well. With 20% lifesteal and much more stable passive damage, Doomsday has effectively become a universal item for heroes who scale with physical attack or rely on on-hit damage. Even though its base stats were slightly reduced, farming speed has not slowed down at all. In fact, it has actually increased due to the removal of the damage limit against minions and jungle monsters, and the added HP further improves survivability. Because of all these changes, I'd confidently say this is a buff to Doomsday, and it's probably the offensive item that received the biggest buff in this entire update. The second on-hit item is Sparkforged Dagger. The price of this item has been increased from 1840 to 2020, which is honestly a pretty big jump. However, this price increase was compensated by adding 35 flat physical attack to the item. Because of this trade-off, the change overall counts as a balanced adjustment. You could even argue that it's a slight buff considering which heroes usually build this item, but the buff itself isn't significant enough to clearly label it as one. Surprisingly, no existing stats were reduced. The item simply became more expensive and gained physical attack, which it previously did not have. That's why it fits perfectly into the balanced category. Another important thing to keep in mind is that after this update, almost all heroes who rely on or scale with physical attack have had their scaling adjusted to benefit more from bonus physical attack. As I mentioned earlier, most heroes now scale better with physical attack than before. Because of that, the addition of flat physical attack to Sparkforged Dagger is actually very valuable and makes this item more relevant in the current meta. Now let's talk about the third item slot in on-hit builds. Traditionally, on-hit builds didn't really have a dedicated third item of their own. Instead, they usually borrowed from crit builds, most commonly Sunchaser or Daybreaker's Virtue. Unlike crit builds, which have clearly defined core items, on-hit builds have always lacked a truly exclusive third item. With the recent changes, however, Sunchaser has been pushed more heavily into the crit system. It now provides more crit rate while having its attack speed reduced, which makes it a bit unfair for on-hit builds. As a result, buying these items for on-hit builds feels worse than before. In practice, the total damage output might still be roughly the same, but the itemization feels less efficient, especially because part of the stats, like crit rate, ends up being wasted. That said, for on-hit builds, going straight into Sunchaser after Sparkforged Dagger and Doomsday is still a strong option and provides very solid lane pressure. You do end up wasting the crit rate it offers, but aside from that inefficiency, the rest of the stats still work well enough. Even so, I really hope that on-hit builds receive a dedicated third item in the future, just like crit builds have, to make their item path feel more complete and fair. Bloodweeper didn't just become 200 gold more expensive, it also lost 10 points of physical attack. These changes were made to compensate for the addition of 20% physical skill Lifesteal. Skill Lifesteal means you recover HP when your skills hit a target, not from basic attacks. On paper, this may sound decent, but there is a major catch that significantly reduces its real value. In Honor of Kings, Skill Lifesteal has strong diminishing returns. If your skill is a small AoE ability, the healing you receive is reduced by half. If it's a large area AoE skill, the healing is reduced even further, down to just 25% of the damage dealt. Because of this mechanic, the actual healing you get from Bloodweeper in real fights is far lower than what the item description suggests. Due to these limitations, Bloodweeper's overall cost-effectiveness has dropped to an extremely low level. It simply cannot compete with Doomsday, which I discussed earlier, or even Mortal Punisher, which I'll talk about next. Compared to those options, Bloodweeper provides far less value for its price. Because of this, I really don't recommend Bloodweeper anymore for heroes who scale heavily with physical attack through basic attacks or even skills, such as Fang. Even though Fang's damage mainly comes from skills, the reduced stats make Bloodweeper a poor choice overall. Going forward, this item should mainly be used by fighters and assassins who can still make situational use of skill lifesteal. Marksmen, however, should completely stop building Bloodweeper. Instead, they should choose between Mortal Punisher or Doomsday depending on the match situation and what their team actually needs. If you look at the stats and price of Mortal Punisher, you can see that it is fairly well adjusted overall. Its price has been increased, but this was compensated by buffs to its stats, such as an extra 5% attack speed and 5% lifesteal. In addition to that, the HP it provides has also been increased by around 140. On paper, these changes look reasonable and keep the item functional. However, the biggest issue with Mortal Punisher is that it has lost its biggest advantage from before, which was being cheap. Previously, players could buy this item much earlier in the game to deal with healing-heavy opponents. Now, because of the higher cost, you will most likely end up building this item much later into the game. And when you already have a full 6-item build, the extra 5% lifesteal it provides does make it slightly stronger in the late game, but it doesn't feel as impactful as it used to when purchased early. Mortal Punisher is still a situational anti-heal item, and that hasn't changed. If you thought the developers were trying to turn it into a universal item, then that's simply not the case. It was never meant to be universal, and it probably never should be. If anti-heal items became universally strong, then all healing-based heroes would need their healing values increased to compensate, which would create even bigger balance problems. If the intention behind these changes was to encourage more attack-scaling heroes to build Mortal Punisher, then it doesn't seem to be fully working yet. Compared to the magic anti-heal item Venomous Staff, Mortal Punisher still feels weaker in terms of raw stats, even before considering passives. Because of all this, I would place Mortal Punisher in the balance category, rather than calling it a buff or a nerf. They reduced 25 points of physical attack from Master Sword, and on top of that, it no longer provides the 400 mana that it used to. In exchange for these losses, the item now grants 15% attack speed, which it previously didn't have. You could say that the developers intentionally shifted the item away from burst damage and tried to turn it into something more oriented towards sustained damage instead. However, it's hard to see which heroes can truly make good use of that added 15% attack speed. Even for fighters and assassins, while 15% attack speed can feel noticeable in practice, it doesn't really make up for losing 25 points of physical attack, which is a very significant stat reduction. That loss directly hurts the burst potential that this item was originally known for. For marksmen, Master Sword feels even worse now. Even for heroes like Chano, Agudo, or Flowborn, who rely heavily on frequent skill usage, this item is simply weaker compared to alternatives like Shadow Ripper. It doesn't provide enough value to justify picking it over other crit or damage-oriented options. Overall, the item's strength has clearly gone down. Master Sword was previously valued for its burst potential, and that identity has been heavily diluted by these changes. Because of that, I would confidently classify this update as a nerf to the item. The price of Deep Frost Siege has been reduced by 20 gold, but at the same time its attack speed has been lowered by 5%. Even with this change, auto-attack-based heroes and poke-oriented heroes can still comfortably build this item. For marksmen like Marco Polo in particular, attack speed breakpoints are no longer as critical as they used to be, so the loss of 5% attack speed isn't something you need to overthink. This adjustment also doesn't force you to drop or rearrange other core items just to fit Deep Frost Siege into your build. It still functions in the same role, and fulfills the same purpose as before without disrupting standard build paths. Overall, there isn't a major functional change to the item. It performs largely the same in real matches, but because of the slight stat reduction, I'd still classify this rework as a minor nerf. Demon's Bane has received a small buff overall. Its base magic defense has been increased, and the amount of HP it provides has also gone up. However, there is a trade-off. The magic defense granted by its passive now gradually decreases over time. Because of this, the item is strongest when built early, before the passive fully decays. If you purchase Demon's Bane while its passive is still active or stacking, it can actually provide more magic defense than it did before the update. On the other hand, if you delay it too long, you won't fully benefit from the passive value. So the key is timing. Build it early to maximize its effectiveness. Taking everything into account, this change is still a buff to Demon's Bane. For Tempest, both its physical attack and the amount of HP it provided have been reduced, and in return, it received an extra 5% attack speed. The real question, though, is why this change was even made. Tempest has always been in a strange spot. It's an item you often see players building, yet it rarely appears in popular or meta builds. That contrast is honestly a bit weird, and even funny at times, and it's still a slight nerf to this item. And finally, the last physical item we'll be discussing in this video is Destiny. Destiny was never really anyone's first choice, nor was it an item you would want to keep permanently in your build. It has always been mainly used as a swap item together with Sage's Sanctuary, the resurrection item. They reworked Destiny in a way that seems intended to encourage players to actually keep it in their build instead of only using it as a last moment swap. Its physical attack and attack speed were increased, and it was also given an additional 600 HP. To balance these buffs, they removed the 5% cooldown reduction it previously provided and also increased its price. However, the problem is that the numbers they gave it are still not generous enough, and its cooldown remains at 120 seconds. This makes it feel underwhelming despite the added stats. So even if the intention was to make players build Destiny earlier and more often, it still doesn't live up to that goal. It's still not recommended to build or rush this item early in the game. On top of that, the price increase weakens the Sage's Sanctuary plus Destiny swap strategy, and I'm saying this based on my own experience. The stats Destiny provides are not strong enough for it to be considered a core item in normal builds. Any hero that actually needs these 3 stats Destiny provides would be better off looking at alternatives like Deep Frost Siege. Unfortunately, because of all these reasons, this item ends up being a nerf overall. And that's it for this video, lads. Sorry, but I'll be discussing magical and defensive items in future videos. I actually wanted to cover all of them in a single video, but that didn't seem possible for now. As you all know, my exams were ongoing, and I didn't really have enough time to properly work on videos. That's also why it has been many days since I last uploaded. So to avoid completely messing up the algorithm, I decided to produce this video as quickly as I could and upload it first. Now that my exams are finally over, I'll be posting videos much more frequently. Don't worry, I'll definitely cover the remaining equipment in detail, and those videos will probably be even better than this one since I'll be able to put more effort and time into them. For now, I'd really request you all to please both hype and like this video, subscribe to my channel to join my amazing W subscribers family, comment down your queries, and share this video with your friends. And if you're on Instagram, you can give me a follow there as well. If you're somehow financially stable, you can also support me by joining my channel membership. I'll really appreciate these things. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, bye and love y'all.